Arratsalde on guztioi, niri dagokit gaur arratsaldeko mahai ingurua aurkeztea. Gurekin batera hemen mahaian Brandon Hamber, Asun Lasa eta Iñaki García Arrizabalaga ditugu.
So first, please welcome Brandon Hamber. He's a teacher at Ulster University, professor, and an expert at INCORE. He's South African originally, and he studied psychology.
Eta bide horretatik heldu da bizikidetza eta bake prozesuak
aztertzera, hain zuzen ere biktimei
entzunez Hegoafrikako
and the case of victims. He will give us examples from international examples and specifically from South Africa and Northern Ireland. Beside him, Asun Lasa, the sister of Josiane Lassa, she will explain how and why she came here today. Iñaki Garcia will also present his case. I'd first like to give the mic to Brandon Hamber. Remember that you'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end. So you'll have a white page at the end of your brochure. You can put your questions down in any language you like, and the member of the organization here will collect the questions and present them at the end. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of the round table. So please, let's turn over to Brandon Hamber.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for the kind introduction. Thank you also for hosting me in your very lovely city. It's very nice to be here, and I hope that what I have to contribute today will be of use to you all. I thought that what I would do is first begin by just making some general introductory comments about Northern Ireland, South Africa, the places that I know best. And then I thought, to help the discussion, I will just make 4 points, lessons that I have learned from the South African process and from the Northern Ireland process. I'm not sure if those lessons will directly apply to your context and how you would like to use those lessons, because every situation is different, every society is different. But certainly between South Africa and Northern Ireland, the 4 lessons that I will talk about are things that we have learned and have been difficult to deal with. So by way of introduction, it is interesting that I think South Africa, the Basque situation, and Northern Ireland have always been linked with each other in some way, and the peace processes have overlapped at different moments in time, and there have been a number of people who have moved between the different places. People from Northern Ireland who oversaw the decommissioning process here, people from South Africa who oversaw the decommissioning process in Ireland. Many different peacemakers have moved between these contexts. And I'm not sure what that's about, but to me it feels that there is a special connection between these different places, and we're obligated to learn from each other. And I think the first issue in relation to that, and certainly that I have learned working in this area now for some 20 years or more, is that the process takes a long time. And it's hard to imagine in South Africa and in Northern Ireland, we are now more than 20 years from the peace agreements in both places. And so we've learned many positive things from those peace processes, but we've also learned negative things, things that don't necessarily work. And it is interesting for me to be sitting here today because I think for Northern Ireland and for South Africa, both of those peace processes 20 years on are also fragile again, but in different ways. I don't think we will go back to the past in the same way, but there are many challenges that still sit in both those societies 20 years later. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, although we've made formal peace, only 6% of children go to schools which are integrated. So the majority of children still go to schools which are Catholic or Protestant schools. The vast majority of people still live in neighborhoods which are either Catholic or Protestant. And if we think of South Africa, although there have been many changes and many positive changes, the inequality between the white and the black community in South Africa still exists and still creates tensions in those societies. So for us, that means that whatever we engage in, we have to think about however long the conflict took, building the peace is probably going to take as long. And that's a very difficult message to hear when you've lived through very difficult and challenging times, that process is going to take a long time. So now to the specific lessons that I wanted to raise, and I said to you I would raise 4. So the first of these is, if we're thinking about dealing with the past, addressing the needs of society, addressing the needs of victims, our first question is we have to understand or ask the question, why do we want to address the past? So why do we want to address the past? And it sounds like a simple question, but actually it's not a simple question. So are we addressing the past because we want to heal the hurts of victims? Are we addressing the past because we want to build a different economic future? Are we addressing the past because we want reconciliation? Are we addressing the past because we want justice? And of course we might say we want all of these things, but the challenge in dealing with the past is that quite often these issues can also contradict each other. So in South Africa, when we set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the commission was set up to look at the causes, the nature, and the extent of the conflict. And actually, different processes are needed for different parts of that. So if we want to know about the extent of a conflict, then maybe that's quite a technical task. In Northern Ireland, we have managed to use GPS to mark on maps where every single death took place. So we can say from which community they were from, which background were they from, and where people died. That's a technical task of counting what happened. If we want to understand the causes of a conflict, that's a lot more difficult. Why did it happen? Who did what to whom? And in those contexts, it's often where people talk about processes like truth commissions, which might not just be interested in the numbers and the technicalities, but actually try and address the wider context or the systemic questions as to why a conflict happened. And in Northern Ireland today, there is still no overarching process for dealing with the past, and that is partly because people are still very nervous about addressing the issue of causes. We still can't come to terms with the issues of causes. So the challenge for me in that first issue of why are we addressing the past is for you to ask that question seriously. And I think at first it sounds easy, but as you get into it, it becomes quite difficult. So we might say we want justice, but actually justice might deliver something very positive for some victims, but it might, for the society, create other types of tensions and problems. So there are going to be contradictions that we're going to have to manage. The way we have resolved that in Northern Ireland, at least at the level of rhetoric, is we often say the process we want to seek is one which is victim-centered, but society-wide. So it is, the victims have to be at the center of the process, but the primary aim is about the society as well. And trying to marry those two things together can be difficult. The second general point that I wanted to make is that the lessons from both societies is that, yes, it takes a long time, but also you need lots of different processes. There is no society that has developed one mechanism, say a truth commission, or prosecutions, or reparations, that has fully addressed the past. They're going to need multiple processes over a long period of time. And I thought I would give the example of the 1972 Bloody Sunday killings in Northern Ireland that some people might be aware of, where 14 civilians were killed. And in preparation for this talk, I just did a quick list. What were some of the things that happened around this process? And just doing the list very quickly, there were at least 8 processes. So the first of these were that the families campaigned for an inquiry. The victims of the families campaigned for an inquiry for 30 years. There were journalists who wrote books about that process. There were investigations into the process. So the victims formed solidarity groups. That was number one. Number two, there were at least 2 very important films about the process. And some people would say the films about what happened on that day educated more people than many other processes. At the same time, there was also a commission of inquiry which ran from 1998 to 2010. It cost nearly $200 million pounds. And that process formally found that the victims who were killed on that day were innocent. So there was an inquiry, was the third part of that process. The fourth part of the process was that David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, issued an apology. So that's a fourth process. The fifth is on the back of this process, the victims and the local community built a museum. And the museum is now where they house the memories and there are people who are visiting that. The sixth is that although many families were happy with the apology and the inquiry, some of them have decided they still want prosecution. So now some families are engaging in a process of justice. The sixth is, or the seventh, is now the museum is in place. Actually, what started to happen is people from other communities are now visiting the museum. So now a whole new process has started up where people are sharing stories about different massacres from different sides of the conflict. So actually, what started quite narrowly is now ended in a bigger process of people talking. And that's just one example. So my second lesson was really, we have to expect the process to be long, but we're not going to find the one mechanism. So we need to be looking creatively for lots of different approaches. The third lesson, and this is quite a difficult one, is that dealing with the past is always political. So we might like to think that if we're addressing the needs of victims, we could offer counseling and support and medical care, and these things are important. But at the same time, people will have other needs like acknowledgement and truth and justice. And politicians might say to us, and they say it in Northern Ireland, well, if we just get the economy working and we get young people employed, the conflict will go away. Well, of course that would help, but some of the differences and the memories are so deep that even that's not going to resolve the conflict. And so these are political questions that are very difficult. They're very difficult questions for us to deal with. And one of the key political questions inside of that, and I see it as a political question and not a technical question, is that in both the societies I have worked in, is there is a battle over narratives. There is a battle over what is the story of the past. How do we tell that story? And I've seen that very strongly in both of those societies. And on some levels, we might wish that we could turn that into a technical task, that we could say, we can get some historians and they could write the definitive history and we could all agree that that's exactly the way it happened. But unfortunately, in the societies we live, that's just not the way it ends up working. And most of the thinking in societies today that have been through conflict is the only way we can address that issue is through what we would call multi-perspectivity. We have to appreciate there are multiple perspectives. Some of those perspectives might be historically wrong, they might technically be wrong, but it doesn't mean that we could talk people out of their positions. And so our first step, and this has happened a lot in Northern Ireland, has been to accept that there are different narratives and to at least put the narratives next to each other. So start to say, this group has this narrative, another group has this narrative, and work really hard at a community level to share those narratives. Initially, not with the idea of changing each other's narratives, initially just to respect that we have different narratives. And over time, certainly with some community groups I've observed, actually the narratives do change. But in the beginning, we have to recognize maybe that we're dealing with multiple perspectives and multiple narratives. And that's a real challenge. It's been a challenge for Northern Ireland, it's been a challenge for South Africa, and I would guess it's a challenge for you in your society today. But it's also a political task. And we all have a job to also create the groundwork for how people talk about really difficult issues. And that's a political task in terms of how politicians lay that groundwork. It's a civil society task in terms of how civil society lay the groundwork. The fourth and final lesson that I would like to mention is that dealing with the past has to be coherent. And what I mean by that is the different parts of any strategy, and I've already said one would need lots of different strategies, is we do need to think about how they relate with each other. And if I think of Northern Ireland and South Africa, they're sort of the opposite. Because what South Africa did was it largely felt that its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'm happy to talk more about that in questions, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was our method for dealing with the past. So we put all of our energies into that approach, and we felt that that would be the mechanism for dealing with the past. And we didn't invest as much in our community level engagement, in those type of social processes. In Northern Ireland, the process has often been has been very different. There is no overarching process. We've invested millions through the EU Peace Programme into lots of communities telling their stories, collecting their stories, meeting, talking with each other. There are other legal processes that have been going on. So in that context, what we have, I would argue, is almost too many processes. And in South Africa, maybe too few processes. So we have to pay attention to how coherent are these different strategies. So for example, if we offer reparation or compensation, but we don't offer truth and we don't offer justice, of course victims are going to look at that and say, that's blood money. That's money you're paying me to keep me silent. So your justice process and your truth process has to be coherent with your compensation process. And that's not difficult, it's not easy, and we have to pay really careful attention to how those processes might link with each other. So for me, those would be the four key lessons at a very broad level, and maybe when we're taking questions, we can talk a little bit more closely. The final thing I would say, by way of conclusion, is that unfortunately, wearing my psychologist's hat and from a psychological perspective, the real deep challenge of dealing with the past and for societies that have experienced political violence is we are trying to fix something we can never completely fix. We could only fix the problem if we could bring our loved ones back from the dead. If we could turn the clock back 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. We can't completely fix the problem. But we can show the resolve and the energy and the complete attention to it to continually try different strategies to address it. And I think we need to be realistic as we go into these processes, recognizing that we can never satisfy all the needs, but we have an onus to also show how we are attempting to try and do that. And we have unique opportunities at different moments in time in history. I've been lucky enough to live through those in South Africa and Northern Ireland, where we have to attempt to do that. I thought, and everybody seems to be quoting poetry and Albert Camus and various erudite people, so I thought I would end by quoting from Seamus Heaney, the famous Irish poet, and I'll have to make the translators work very hard because I'm not sure we can get the translation in the way that he has written it. But I would just like to end with some of his words. And he says, "History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history can rhyme. So hope for that great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that the further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells." So thank you very much.
Mila esker, Brandon.
Based on the international experience, moving from that to the Basque Country, this is what we're going to talk about in greater detail with we'll hear about this from two people who are here with us today and who are involved in the peace process and the process for building a coexistence. Two significant groups. One of them was prisoners. We have the prisoners on one side and the victims on the other. So we have the two different categories of victims that we'll hear from. But I would like to ask them to tell us their stories and to say where they've come from and how they've arrived here today, even though they will have to do this in a short summarized version. We'll start with Iñaki García Arrizabalaga. Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. Firstly, I'd like to thank Basque Country and the Brokers of Peace for the opportunity to talk to you here this evening. And as the moderator has asked me, I'm going to keep this short. My father, Juan Manuel García, was kidnapped and assassinated by the anti-capitalist autonomous commandos in 1980 in San Sebastián. These armed groups were a group which broke off from ETA politico-military, and they didn't want to break up. So it was a faction which came from them, a group which were called the Comandos Autonomos Anticapitalistas, or Anti-Capitalist Autonomous Commandos. I spent the first 4 years after the death of my father immersed in a world of hatred, because I believed that as to be a good son, that was my duty to feel that. And that hatred was a mirror of my reality. It was a filter which showed in me life in a very simplistic manner. And I was not aware of the fact that I was falling, I was going down a very slippy slope, until I got to the point where, when I went abroad for a long period of time, I became aware that I was ruining my life, and that group hadn't only assassinated my father, but they were assassinating me. And that exercise in selfishness was what enabled me to say, I don't want to continue like this for the rest of my life. I want to get out of this hole. And I was able to join another victim of terrorism to begin to work in favor of obtaining peace in the Basque Country. And since 1996, I have been participating in different organizations which have worked in the southern Basque Country for reconciliation and peace in the Basque Country. I think that is enough for this initial presentation. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for this invitation to speak in front of you. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I was 6 years old in 1992 when my father was, my brother was detained. I was detained. He was detained. And for 7 days at that age, it was very, very difficult. And Every quarter of an hour was an eternity. And with 14 months later, my brother Josean Lassa and his friend Jose Sabala were kidnapped in Bayonne, and for 12 years we had no news about them at all. We thought that it was the civil guard in Spain who had done this, because I had only escaped from them shortly before then, and it was very difficult when your brother disappears. You also learn that you learn that they were the ones who kidnapped them. When we were at home with the family, we firstly were relieved that this was the case. It was the civil guard. This question of where they were was laid to rest to a certain extent. We then later found out that they'd been tortured, they'd been buried, and that's something which for the family was terrible. After finding out that they were dead, of course, finding out how they died, we tried to look at the bright side of things, and we tried to prepare as best as possible the return of their body, to leave behind all our negative feelings. And we then became victims again in Hondarribia, because the police hit us again when one of our friends was injured, and when we arrived in Tolosa, we thought that the coffins were there and that was the end of it, but I don't want to give you the details. What I'm trying to say is that we were victims time after time. The suffering, the pain accumulates and never leaves us. We were never allowed to bury them peacefully. And so this was something that was very difficult to experience and to go through. And that's what I'd really like to highlight today. We all know what happened. And as Iñaki said before, it's afterwards when we realise that you suffer and that it hurts a lot. But along with this suffering and pain, there's also a great deal of hatred. If I had enough force, enough strength, I was very, very angry, and I said to myself I had to go beyond this. I had 2 children, and so I looked for help, and what helped me was what a friend said to me. We are not responsible for what we feel, but we are responsible for what we do. And so my anger, in addition, I was angry, and I was supposed to be angry, and so this is very difficult to manage. It's a very paradoxical state of mind. And I was lucky, amongst other things, to be able to meet other victims on the initiative of the Basque government. And for me, this was one of the most important moments, because I was being listened to. people were being listened to, people talked to each other, they heard each other, and they knew that the tears were shared. And that's when we asked to be heard with respect. We needed this. And that's what I'd like to, that's what the feeling that I remember today. Thank you very much. I imagine it's very not easy to talk about this. I would like, based on your experience, I'd like to think what is the role of the victims in the Basque Country? How do you see the role of victims and what they can contribute, whether it be yourselves or others? Well, I would like to remind you something which came out in the ex-minister's words and Brandon's words, and the words spoken by the victims of terrorism. Textually, it was said there cannot be a sustainable peace without truth and justice. Well, let's go for it. As a victim, the first thing that I want is the right to hear the truth. And that means knowing who did what, who allowed what to happen, who carried out the action which led to certain results. For example, the assassination of my father almost 40 years later, it's a case which was never cleared up. There was no court case, nothing happened at all. My father died for no reason at all. So what I want is for this case, the case of my father's assassination, to be cleared up, and for so many of ETA's crimes which still haven't been resolved. But I'm also aware that, for example, the victims of certain state crimes also I find it very, very complicated indeed to get to the truth. And when they try to find out what happened, I think we need to ask for this for everyone and say that this does not mean believing or creating bands or conflicts. It's simply recognizing that a victim has the right to know what actually happened. And as a society, we shouldn't be frightened of assuming and finding out things which perhaps we don't like to hear. Let me give a good example. Very recently, in the southern Basque Country, and with a rigorous method, a report was publicized about torture in the Basque Country. We need to recognize, without being condescending socially, we shouldn't be frightened about hearing the truth. Hearing the truth involves providing means, resources to recognize it. It has been said that the second element which is needed for sustainable peace is justice. I believe that there is a danger in interpreting everything that's happened in terms of new stories. When we're looking towards the future as if nothing had happened in the past. No. I cannot admit this, because that means an additional victimization for myself. I cannot tolerate the impunity. I cannot tolerate impunity, because I insist that would mean making me a victim again. And therefore, I want the right to justice. I want the murderers of my father to appear in front of a court and be judged with all the guarantees that should exist in a state of law. Is that asking too much? I don't think so. I believe that we should begin to fill with content. We need to back up all these big words with acts and come back to earth. We need to come back to earth with truth and justice, and we need to materialize them. I believe that the victims, as victims, we can make a pre-political interpretation of all of this, because asking for the right for truth and justice is a pre-political feeling. Empathy with somebody who is suffering is a pre-political feeling. And in that sense, I have carried out an exercise, a personal exercise. I have tried to go out of my comfort zone and put myself in the shoes of people who feel and think differently from myself. I have been able to recognize that I don't have a monopoly on suffering, and therefore I need to recognize that there have been many violations of human rights. But that does not mean that there are different sides. If somebody on the side of the Bidasso, that I've been in a band, is very, very wrong indeed. I think that both Ashun and myself are from the same side. We lost a member of our family because somebody thought that the ends justified the means. Perhaps for some it could be a socialist, independent, unified, speaking Basque Country, or it could have been fighting against terrorism. And I think that perverse idea that the ends justify the means is the combat we need to carry forward. That we can't move forward with that perverse idea. I think our role can be an active role, reminding people in society of what actually happened. Brendan, and I liked very much what he said when he talked about the battle of narratives. Multiple perspectives, and it's true. I think that we're not going to be able to agree about what actually happened. I don't think there will be a single interpretation of what actually happened, but I think if Brandon will allow me, with the respect that he has asked for the different narratives, I would add one extra thing. I would say that those narratives, those personal experiences in terms of victimization, must be done with a spirit of coexistence and without hatred. We have to recognize what actually happened. We have to know what actually happened. And I recognize that I don't know everything that happened. I can contribute my own personal account, the suffering of my own family, my own personal trajectory. And I do it without hatred. And I do it because I want the future for future generations to be different than for ours. But at the same time that I do that, I feel legitimized as a victim, and to ask for whoever supported the assassination, who helped the assassination, who cried, "Kill ETA," or "ETA, kill them," or "ETA, more gunpowder." I think they need to criticize, they need self-criticism. It's objective. A member of my family was assassinated. What needs to be recognized is the injustice of that assassination. It should never have happened. And what should never have happened. And if we want this never to happen again, we will need to, all of us will need to look at ourselves, criticize ourselves. And what we cannot do is simply put the counter back at zero and imagine that nothing had happened at all. That's not the case at all. And whoever does not understand this, I don't want to do this out of hatred. I want to just simply know what happened. I want justice to be done in my case. I would like Ashuns to find justice as well. I want whoever supported that fight to recognize that it should never have happened. And looking towards the future, I insist. Looking towards the future, looking towards that battle of narratives or accounts, I am here ready to listen with empathy to anybody at all whose rights were violated and who is from a different side to mine. We have called publicly for abuse by police to also be recognized, because I repeat, if I want the right for justice and truth, then others who have suffered must also benefit from this right. But I insist, I feel legitimized in saying that whoever supported this must look at what happened and recognize that killing was a bad thing and should never have happened at all. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
So, what can we do as a victim? As a victim, I'm not sure what we can do. Just to say I'm a person, I have a life. I've experienced a situation that has made me who I am. I think it's something that's happened to everyone in this room. I don't have a special role. As a person, I have my past, as everyone else does. And from there, as I said earlier, what we can bring is, and I repeat, is to listen to one another and know that it can help us to pass this on and encourage each other. We should, that people see us differently. I lived with somebody who was followed by the police. He had bodyguards. When I heard him speak about what it felt like having bodyguards, I took them in my arms. At the end, I said, now I've met another victim. For us, we need people to realize that victims of ETA and the forces of repression are not always as we think they are. They're not just names. There are a lot of people who suffer, who are suffering, that we don't know their names. I want to get in touch with those people and hear their story and listen to them. We can call one another. We can call one another, and it thinks. But there's. You can say, "Oh, it's easy," but we don't feel the same. I also want respect as a victim. That we all ask for respect. We're not treated the same way, depending on the recognition that we had of the part of the people, from institutions. It's sad because in institutions there are people, in terms of as institutions, they talk a lot about victims of. The term itself, they don't show us much light. It seems necessary to me that we highlight, to bring light, to shine a light on this, what it is. We all need to have a spotlight and to have our story heard. It's sad to leave, for institutions to leave people in the dark who are victims. We also need to be heard. We need reparations. It means that our pain needs to be recognized and acknowledged. 4,000 more tortured people in southern Basque Country. People who, there's all these names which have never been cited. I want us to go down to the victim of the Spanish government, all of the victims. That's how I see things. And that's important to me to say that I'm in the Rabiadi program, I participate, I go into schools, and today it's a different story. I receive a lot from the people, from the young people I see in schools. Some of these kids are 19, 20. That's the age of my brother when he was kidnapped. And they're petrified. And they listen with such attention. And they just listen from somewhere deep inside themselves. And it really helps me to heal. This respect that they have. And today, there's that here as well today. I feel that I've been seen, and I can clearly say that I want to bring out all these people who are who are unknown into the light, people who are victims of the Spanish government, of a police officer abuse, of what is abuse by the police. They're victims of terrorism. That was planned. Our pain was planned, and it's not fair to if someone who's a victim of police abuse, torture leaves marks. Now it doesn't. But it's planned, and not all the killers from the GAL, the GAL, everything's planned, and that victimizes us. It's painful. When I say that, when I have Iñaki next to me, another victim of OTA, the people who are responsible of that are not the victims of the OTA. We're suffering more if we go into that path. It's the institutions and the governments have a huge responsibility here. They're working on with our money. I was supported by the people a lot, but I'm very sad at the fact that institutions play their role as they do. With Iñaki, it's an interesting case, as Iñaki did, to move from where you're from, to move around. I did too. We just needed that support. It was really necessary to get out of the place where we've had a lot of pain. We were protected here, and it's not easy. We hear things that are painful for us, but it's difficult to listen to each other's stories. It's painful. I've caused pain in other victims too, but I don't have a problem with that today. It's painful for me to hear their stories too, but I receive that respectfully. When we hear things from other people, it's very interesting, and we need to share, and we need to move outside the same circles of people who think the same way. We need to come out of our usual circles and create discussion around a dialogue around those circles. In the schools, I encourage them to go beyond their comfort zone and to not be afraid to hear things that are not easy to hear, and just to listen with respect. I'm not sure what else I can add.
Bai.
Madame Taubira has spoke about the thankless task that becomes a gratifying task. You've done a lot of that thankless work. We can hear that in your words. And I'd like to ask you to think about a different thing, another point. In what way can you contribute? What do you think you contribute from this thankless task? Can there be a way to make it gratifying? And if so, how? What would be required to transform this task? What can victims bring to society and to this idea of building our coexistence? As Ashun said, victims of terrorism, we go to schools, several different schools, and we talk to students. What happened for both of us in our experience, for each of us, and for me, I was able to come out of hate and move into building a coexistence. That's my contribution. Another that I could make as a victim of terrorism is to demand or to promote the idea that when you use violence, it's not legitimate. We need to build a future without passing through a stage of violence. One of the ingredients of building our coexistence has to be that using violence as a political instrument, we lose all legitimacy. If we don't do that, history could repeat itself. I think as a victim, I can contribute through this educational message, because youth today understands what happened to us, first of all, and then they understand that from our point of view, there was no possible justification for it. As a victim, I could also contribute by giving my own personal statement as a witness, by telling my story. Because most victims of terrorism, let's just say I only know one case of a victim of terrorism who picked up a weapon in response. in response to the assassination of a member of their family. The large majority, the majority of victims of terrorism reacted peacefully and did not look for armed conflict. Most victims educated their children about values of respect to short-circuit this cycle of hatred and this mounting hatred. This message is a value in itself. Hatred there's no place for hatred with us. I believe that we are living examples of what happened, and it's uncomfortable, and it makes us feel ill at ease, and it's not easy to talk about. As I've already said, I insist on the fact, and I put a lot of energy into the idea that the suffering of other victims must be recognized. I believe firmly in this, and I've said that the future, the people of the future should judge us on what we were able to achieve outside of our comfort zone. And having said that, I think we want an inclusive memory for the future. We want remembrance that includes everybody. All of the breaches of human rights, without comparing, without justifications, without a flag. And my personal obsession is for those who come after us, to free them from this charge, this burden that we have had to bear. And I'm betting on the fact that small initiatives made on a local level, simple gestures, we need to go from the bottom up and to build our coexistence in villages, in neighborhoods where hatred has been very prevalent at certain times. This process of ethical decontamination, as I call them, it's going to take a lot of time. As Brandon said, you can't undo 50 years of violence, sectarism, and hatred overnight. It's not a switch that you can turn on and off. Of course, it will take time. So we need to put this kind of initiative in place. We need to implement it locally so we can coexist. It has to be built from the grassroots, from the roots up. And we have to continue to denounce things that we esteem intolerable. I read in a Wikipedia in the presentation about that tomorrow there's an event for prisoners in favor of prisoners' cause. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. When I hear that the consequences of the conflict are the victims and the prisoners, it doesn't seem right to me at all. I have a problem with that. I'm not on one side and prisoners on another. No, it's not what I mean. I recognize that the family of a prisoner has their own pain. Sending the prisoners to the far corners of the country has created a double punishment for the families. With the same vigor that we should bring, I say we should bring back prisoners back, but the same idea when we have a village celebration every time someone gets out of prison, and we pay tribute to them as a warrior, as a fighter. It gets rid of, for me, it delegitimizes the peace process. And as a consequence, we're going to try to put the cards on the table, all the cards on the table.
As you said, I would like to, as a person, bring my own experience. With what, when you suffer a lot, to try to, it helped me a lot to move away from the violence and the hatred. When you move away from this, we are able to better manage the pain and the suffering. And I want to really be clear on this point. The work, the positive work for young people. Very few ask me, Galindo is free today. What do you think about this? It doesn't hurt me that he's not in jail. It doesn't stop me from sleeping at night. What stops me from sleeping is what is behind it. The reason they brought him out of jail was because they had a lot of things to hide. There must be a lot of things that are truths that are still hidden. And at the same time, there are people who've been in jail for 30 years who have no prospect of coming out. I don't want to start fighting so that Galindo and to go back to jail. If society is more at peace, it's better for everybody. I want to these celebrations, to the welcoming of prisoners when they're released, but I don't glorify what they did. I know that they suffered in prison. I know what prison is, and so I go to the reception, and it reminds me what I would have liked to have said to my brother, welcome home. So I say this with a lot of respect. It's not against anybody. It's not to say that what you did was, what they did was right, but it was just to say they suffered a lot in prison and to welcome them back into society. And I think we need to accept what I have the utmost respect for Iñaki. But I will continue to go to these gatherings, but the aim is not to glorify what the prisoners did. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding on this point, because we've talked a lot with Iñaki and have been able to agree on many things. Before we open questions up to the floor, there will be we'll pass a microphone around so you can ask your questions. But before that, I would like to ask Brandon, and perhaps I'm sure that Ashun and Iñaki will have an answer to this. He mentioned the fact that they're very long processes. The two friends we have here today show this. It's decades. This is something that happened decades ago. These are long processes. So how do we manage time? Time is a key factor. When should we start thinking about things? Based on international experience, what could we conclude?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the question, and also thank you for your comments. They're just really helpful to listen to. I'll address the issue of time, but like all good panelists, I wanted to weigh in on the last the last questions, just to make a simple point, which was, as you were talking and reflecting on what can victims do, or what is the role of victims, I guess the thought which came to my mind was, well, what is the role of people who aren't victims, for victims? And I can't speak for you in terms of what your role is, but we can all speak for what is the role of people who aren't victims. What came to my mind, thinking about the different contexts I've looked at, is one of our main roles as non-victims is not to use victims. And what I've seen in so many different contexts is the way victims are used. They're used for political ends. They're used by people who want to make different points. If victims want to engage in politics, that's fine. That's their choice. But it's important that we don't use victims in political processes. And that can happen in so many different ways. There are victims in South Africa who would say they feel that the idea of reconciliation, as much as some people think it's good, also silenced them. It also made it hard for them to express their anger. So sometimes it might not be about a very visible form of manipulation of victims. Sometimes people can think they're doing the right thing, but in doing that are also silencing people. And so I think it's really important that we ask the hard question, what is our responsibility? And in South Africa, we often talk about 4 different roles. So we'll say there's the role of victims, there's the role of perpetrators, there's the role of beneficiaries, people who benefited from the past, and there's also the role of witnesses and people who also sometimes kept silent. And so there are lots of different roles, and if we really want to engage in the past, we have to be thinking much more widely. And I think what is very key for all of that in terms of silencing is that we allow people the space to be angry. And both of you mentioned, being angry and feeling that at different points in time. And I think in political processes, we often set them up to not allow people to be angry. And of course, people should be angry. And that is part of the process of addressing the past. In terms of the timing question, this is a question which comes up in Northern Ireland particularly all the time. And as I said, there isn't an overarching process for dealing with the past. There are many different processes, but there isn't an overarching one. And one of the phrases you will hear people say a lot is they keep saying the timing is not right. The timing is not right for a big truth and justice process because the peace process isn't stabilized enough. The timing is not right because people are still too angry in the society. And I maybe now look at that and sort of think, well, is the timing ever right? I don't know if the timing is ever right. The process can be right, and we can set in motion certain types of political structures that can help with that. But I think if we use the phrase of saying the timing is not right, I've just seen that as a way of not doing things in Northern Ireland rather than doing things. This is not to say that in some specific mechanisms we have to be aware of timing questions. And I sometimes think instead of using the word timing, sometimes, I don't know how it translates, but using the idea of sequencing is a better way of thinking about it. Sometimes we have to sequence processes to get the most out of them. So I will use an example from Sierra Leone. So in Sierra Leone, they had a special court to prosecute people who had committed crimes against humanity. So people who had commanded crimes at the top levels of society. Then they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was to talk about the wider story. And perpetrators who hadn't committed war crimes could also come before the Truth Commission. But in terms of sequencing, they ran those two processes at the same time. And that was not helpful, because it meant that some people who maybe would have come and given a truth to the Truth Commission were worried at that moment they might be they might be prosecuted. So the two processes probably didn't reach as far as it could because they didn't get the sequencing right. So I guess I'm saying I don't know if there's an easy answer to the timing, and my sense is don't let the timing hold us back. But that doesn't mean in the more minute processes of how we think about different mechanisms, we have to think about, it was the point I made about coherence, how do they relate to each other so that they don't undermine the benefit of the different processes.
Irekiko dugu zerbait nahi baldin badezue gehitu.
Sí. Respecto al tiempo, yo no sé qué percepción se tendrá desde este lado del Bidasoa, pero yo lo que veo en la sociedad en la que vivo es que hay un deseo de pasar página demasiado rápido. De querer olvidar rápidamente una fase de nuestra historia de la que no nos sentimos especialmente orgullosos. Y yo creo que el tiempo corre en contra nuestra en este sentido. Y, por ejemplo, en el último centro escolar en el que yo estuve prestando testimonio, hablaba a chicas y chicos de 15, 16 años, ya no saben, no han vivido eso. O sea, yo les hice una serie de preguntas y no saben, o sea.
And they just simply didn't realize what happened. It was like science fiction, something that's happened a long time ago. Time is going against us. I can use it as a defense mechanism. As we don't feel very proud about our past, we want to just simply forget it. But I think that as victims, our role is to resist this natural inertia which exists in society. Well, now, if any of you would like to make any comments or ask any questions, then please raise your hand and we'll pass around the microphone. Please make your questions as concise and as clear as possible so that people can participate. I have a question for Iñaki. I'd like to thank Iñaki, and I'm not saying I'm not the only person to say this. I'm not sure whether we've been able to hear you correctly through the mic. If you could hold it closer. I think it is very important. What you're saying is very important. The first thing, you said that it is the most important thing for you is to know the truth. And the second thing is to judge people. For you, could it be enough, yes or no, to judge people? Is it enough to just simply to know the truth, to know where those who are responsible are, who they are, and not send them to jail? Not send them to jail. Is it just simply, in your eyes, is it just simply enough to know who was responsible? In your case, for example, what would you say? In some cases, there were a conflict between the right to know the truth and the right to justice. If in some cases to obtain justice, or if we're frightened to obtain justice, we were unable to find out the truth, I believe, at least even personally, we need to know the truth. That's the most important. However, I don't see these things as incompatible. Let me give you a very concrete example of this. I am a victim of terrorism who has met with ETA prisoners in Nanclares. We have had meetings together with ETA prisoners. I know that those prisoners know many things that they don't tell us. I'm sure they know a lot more than they tell us. And I understand why they're frightened about saying everything they know to the justice. I fully understand that why they're frightened. So let's make it easier for them to tell the truth. And if in any case there were a conflict between the two, then the most important is the right to know the truth. Or perhaps there could be symbolic convictions in order for the truth to be made public. Yes, over there.
Good afternoon, everyone. As we're going for different realities, completely different realities and different people and different types of victims and different victimizations, some people have access to truth, but there are other types of victims. Victims of the government, state-based terrorism, and despite everything that we could dream of, imagine, we know that the access to the truth will be a very difficult path, strewn with obstacles. And we see the kind of democracy there is in the Spanish government, that's presented as a government, but it's lacking a lot of things. And the main one is the lack of access to information, that we deny access to truth and justice as an extension. We have to accept reparations in this done in any odd way. I'm not a victim. I'm not speaking as a member of the Basque Parliament or as a victim of terrorism, but as a person. What methodology, what strategy can we implement? Can we establish? How can we demand from the Spanish government? Who do we need to ask? For the Spanish government to stop putting obstacles in the way of all the victims that exist, so that they can have the same rights. It would take. It is necessary for all victims of breaches in human rights to have the same kinds of recognition and reparations.
Billy, no lo sé. Solo te digo que
I don't. What I want to say is that, as a victim of state-based terrorism, I agree. It's very important. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a politician. I'm not a technician. But my heart tells me that what you're saying is true and correct, and it's worthy, and that's worth something.
Yes.
Good evening, and thank you, all the participants of the round table. I'm a victim of the government. When I was 10, the government put a bomb. It almost killed me. I lost a leg, the vision in one of my eyes, and it caused a lot of pain to my family.
en la mesa de operaciones una manifestación a las 8
When
horas del
I
atentado,
was
gritaba debajo de casa de mis padres, Goraeta militar.
in the operating
A mí
theatre,
me gustaría saber, no sé si
people
tendré la
were
respuesta, o
tapping
pongo
under
en un
the window of
compromiso,
my parents. I don't know if you know the answer.
pero ese aliento que le dio la sociedad al terrorismo,
This encouragement from
principalmente de ETA, yo vivo en
the
Rentería,
society
un pueblo
towards
marcado
the
por la violencia.
government terrorism. I live in Eritrea.
¿De qué
It's very
manera la
marked by
sociedad,
violence. How
así como
society, how does
víctimas
society,
de GAL o de abusos policiales, en cierta manera la sociedad les
and
puede
this is the same
reconfortar
thing
su-
is
de
for
cierta manera
victims
su
of
apoyo.
police
Las
abuse.
víctimas de ETA principalmente lo que hizo es guardar silencio, aislarnos y demás. Y
We were cut
después
off, we're isolated,
de hacer esa crítica que
outcast.
es obligada por parte de la sociedad,
and then
a mí me causa darle muchas vueltas a la cabeza de qué manera podemos sentir
I felt
esa-
criticism from society.
sentirnos reconfortados por esa
How
sociedad. No sé si el
can we be
experto en conflicto
comforted
nos
by
puede-
that same
nos puede ayudar o-
that same society? How
pero
can
hemos sentido el
the
vacío de
society
la
that's
sociedad
hurt
durante
us
muchísimos años.
heal us?
Nos han colocado
My
a
family
uno de
all
10 años,
felt
se colocaron,
the void
pues bueno, según
in
ellos,
society
directamente
for
en un
many
bando.
years. How
Un
can
niño de
we
10 años no está en ningún bando. Y entonces quiero saber
I
un poco de
don't
qué
consider that
manera
I'm
la
on one
sociedad
side or
nos
the other. I
puede
was a 10 years
reconfortar.
old child.
Personas,
How
a
can I
las
be
víctimas
comforted
durante
by
tantos
a
años
society
nos mantuvo
as a
aislados y
victim
guardó silencio.
that suffered for so many years from being isolated?
Alberto, yo en primer lugar te voy a decir que sí, te entiendo porque yo
I
he vivido ahora
understand
mismo, he vivido casi lo mismo de
you.
la otra parte.
I
Esto no quiere
I
justificar
really
lo que tú has
experienced
dicho,
the
no
same
quiere
thing on the other
quitarle
side.
ningún valor a lo que tú has dicho porque me ha llegado muy hondo
I
porque
don't
creo que es así.
want to take anything away
Creo que
from
es
what you
así.
said because I
Es un
really
poco-
agree.
O a mí me ha parecido algo parecido a lo que yo he ido contando de lo que a mí las
A
instituciones
little
me
bit
han ido cargando
similar
otra
to
vez,
what
¿no?
I
Tanto
talked
cuando
about.
llegaron los cuerpos,
Institutions
los amigos no podían entrar en el cementerio,
have really
tal.
mistreated
Lo
us
mismo,
when
a
we
los
recovered the
25
bodies and we
años
went to the
yo llegué
cemetery.
de una
25
conferencia
years
que había estado en
later,
paz, muy tranquila, muy serena,
I
con mis dos
took
hijos fui a se iba a recordar
part
todos
in a
el
conference
25
on
aniversario.
peace.
Yo fui muy tranquila,
I
ni se me
went-
pasó por la cabeza otra cosa que no
My two
recordar
children,
con
I was
mi-
very
con mi
serene.
gente, con nuestra gente. Estaba
I
muy
didn't think there
tranquila
would
en
be
el
any
triángulo
problems.
cuando sacamos
Was with
las
friends.
fotos de Joshi José.
There was a photo was taken.
Y yo antes
There was
de darme
a
cuenta,
photo
me
of
vi
José
corriendo
José.
hacia mi casa llorando.
And
Mis
before I
dos hijos
realized,
todavía
I
chavales
was
se
running
quedaron,
and crying
el
to
señor
the
se
house.
quedó
My son
golpeando y
stayed.
yo nunca entendí ni nunca me han dicho cómo
And the
ha pasado
police
eso. Te quiero
was
decir con esto, sin
attacking
justificar
us.
una
I didn't
cosa a la
really know what
otra, ¿no? O sea,
happened.
que una cosa no debe tapar la otra,
It's not to
no debe
justify
tapar. Yo
one
creo que
thing
las
with another,
víctimas de ETA sí habéis sufrido todo eso que has
but
dicho, que es muy duro, y que
victims
yo
of
creo que
ETA
tiene que ser muy duro,
suffered
porque yo lo he vivido de la otra
a
parte.
lot.
Vosotros habéis vivido un
I
poco
experienced
igual
it
la
from the other
negación de la
side.
sociedad.
You experienced the
Nos hemos
this
causado
society
como sociedad y
turning
nosotros
away
hemos
from you and
vivido
that
lo mismo y
pain
seguimos viviendo hoy en día por parte de las
and the
instituciones.
pain that others have caused you
Claro, yo
in
voy a decir,
society.
no es menos
We
grave. Tú
we
igual dirás, sí es, vale,
experienced
ahí podemos
that
estar
on behalf
tomando
of
café, una
institutions.
cerveza sin ningún problema, los dos hablando, ¿no? A mí me
We just
duele
can't say,
mucho,
well,
yo
let's go,
es un poco lo
have a
mismo.
beer or
Yo
a coffee
escuchaba,
and talk
me llegaba el
together.
dolor,
But
porque
what I can
nosotros hemos
say,
vivido.
when I
Casi lo
listen
mismo, no
to
por
you, I
parte de la
feel your
sociedad,
pain.
pero sí
I
por
really
parte de las
feel that
instituciones,
we
con toda la fuerza que
experienced
tienen, con todo el poder
something
que tienen,
similar.
y
We
cómo
were
van
not
madres a su casa
isolated
dejando a
by
los chavales
society,
en la
but by
calle,
institutions.
que no querían venir conmigo,
A
y
mother
sabiendo
that
si les
runs
iban a
home in
llevar o no,
tears,
si
leaving her
no.
two children in the street
Es un
because they
poco
didn't
lo
want to
mismo,
come
el
home
dolor
with
que
me.
tú has
And I
mencionado, que
didn't
me
know
llega
what was
muy
going to happen to
profundo.
them.
Bueno, te quería decir eso con mucho cariño.
That's what I wanted to say with a lot of affection.
Well, thank you very much for the last two questions, and they're both really difficult, and I think your response maybe is more appropriate than my response in terms of sharing the pain that people have suffered. And I think that needs to be fully acknowledged. It doesn't matter what society we're in, the story that you tell has a similar feel to so many stories that I've heard of loss and in different ways. I mean, what I might try and do is just try to answer the question, what do you do when a state or a society doesn't want to address certain issues, and this comes up in many different places, and there's no straightforward answer to that question. But all I can say is what I have seen in different places. Certainly civil society approaches have had a big impact in some societies. So if you think of a society like Guatemala, where the state did not want to look at human rights violations, in that context, the Catholic Church, through its network of organizations, started its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, that was not necessarily enough for some victims who wanted official acknowledgement from the state, but they could go out and collect thousands and thousands of testimony, and that began the process that later on there was an official state investigation into the past and a truth commission, because they had actually laid the groundwork for a lot of that work by collecting those stories and collecting those narratives. And I know there are groups in the society that are already doing this, but there have been very structured attempts around the world of civil society to take on truth recovery issues in the absence of a state doing that. The other thing which I think is interesting, and this is linked a little bit to Northern Ireland, is that what has been recognized in Northern Ireland is that different victims have wanted different things from a truth recovery process. And I've already said that there isn't an overarching process agreed in Northern Ireland, but there is a draft legislation, and I think what's interesting in the draft legislation is it recognizes that there are different levels of need. So there's one process where people can ask for their cases to be re-investigated, so a much more formal justice type of a process. But then there's another process which is at a different level, which is called an information retrieval process. And for some victims, they don't necessarily want to go down that route, but they want answers to what seem like small questions to you and me, but are very important questions in terms of dignity, for example. So one of the examples that I saw was the family just wanted to know, why was their son, after he was killed, left in a field overnight and the police didn't lift up his body? Why did they leave him there overnight? And they felt that that was a affront to the dignity of their son, who was, in this case, was a policeman. And through this information recovery process, where they simply go not for prosecution or not for justice, try to find the answers to these type of questions. And there was a body which was set up initially to try and do this. And in that case, they found that the answer was that the army were worried that the body had booby traps attached to it, bombs attached to it. And so they had to wait for a bomb disposal unit to come and investigate the scene. And the bomb disposal units were occupied elsewhere. And so there was a very rational answer as to why, in that case, that indignity to the family had been suffered. And for that family, that was a very comforting thing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are also different levels, and I've seen that people want different answers to different questions. Families, for example, there was another case where somebody had died, and the family just wanted to know who was at the bedside when it happened, because they weren't there. And actually, in that case, the simple piece of information that came out was actually, it was somebody from the other community who had a different political perspective who took the person to the hospital. And so it was actually a very reconciliatory discovery for them, this simple piece of information, that the community they thought who hated them was actually somebody who took their child to the hospital in that case. And so anyway, it's about thinking about these, what are the different levels of truth and the different levels of justice that we might want, and trying to find ways of doing that. The final point to make, and this is not easy and it's not something that sort of happens, but having, certainly in Northern Ireland, seen this process unfold over 20 years, that the state, certainly in the case of the British state, they remain deeply reluctant about opening security files and other sorts of issues. But what we have seen through campaigning and lobbying by different victims at different points in time is that as different administrations have changed, victims groups have used that to lobby for different achievements at different points in time. So when the Blair government came into power and they said they were more liberal in their perspectives, they immediately lobbied that government, who, yes, they didn't open all the files, but they did establish a number of inquiries, including the Bloody Sunday inquiry. And then when the Cameron government came into play, he actually was willing to make an official an apology for that certain atrocity. So we have to think of when are the moments of opportunity, and I don't know enough about your political situation, and I recognize the politics are very difficult and you can't necessarily achieve these things. But over time, I have seen how at different moments in time, groups have been able to put pressure on to get different issues looked at, not always fully, but at least with some progress.
Thank you for taking part. It was not easy. Thank you for everyone who's been here today, everyone who asked questions, and those who listened. We are at the conclusion of our roundtable. Please thank our participants, the warm round of applause.